Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the GRC Summit. As you know, today in the changing world, this unprecedented impact of this global pandemic, the interconnectedness of risk and the velocity at which the risk landscape can change is also happening at a very large and at a very faster pace. The rapidly changing environment has led to digitization of more and more business process, which triggers a rise in threat, risk, and the vulnerability landscape. However, often cyber risk teams and business does not always speak the same language. Hence, it's important for cyber teams to articulate this risk in a way that business can understand. This is where quantification of IT and cyber risk plays a crucial role, where a risk of a security event can be translated into a monetary value. Now, what is the benefit of doing that, right? So one of the largest challenges we see the security leaders face today is to prioritize the cyber risk and their investments. With a dollar value, you can easily now make a risk-aware decisions and communicate the cybersecurity to the board in a better way. This provides a better prioritization of cyber investments and stronger alignment between cyber and business priorities. So we at MetricStream, we are constantly innovating to address some of these emerging trends and challenges. One of our latest innovation in IT and cyber risk space is a cyber risk quantification. We have a new framework that will help organizations express the impact of cyber risk in terms of its monetary value. This framework supports the FAIR methodology and can also support any custom quantification models. So with that, I will hand it over to Shwetha and I'll invite her to do a demo of the platform. Thank you. Over to you, Shwetha.
Thank you, Joy. Hello, everyone. I'm Shwetha and I'm a product manager at MetricStream. As Joy was mentioning, some of the challenges that the cyber risk teams face today and how having a quantification framework will help you overcome some of those challenges. And as Joy mentioned, we have a new cyber risk quantification framework at MetricStream, which is part of our IT and cyber risk management product offering. And as a part of this framework, before we actually get into the live demo, some of the key business values that you can achieve by using this framework is you will be able to demonstrate a robust IT risk management process, which will help build confidence with your regulators and also your executive board. And it's not only that you can improve your performance and also prioritize your cyber risk and see what are those top 5 risks, which has to probably go through remediation much quicker than the other cyber risk exposures that you have. And along with that, it's also helps you, as Joy mentioned, helps you with the prioritization of the cyber risk investments and also provide a valid justification as to why a certain amount of investment is needed. And along with that, the most important thing is you will be able to speak the same language as that of your business. And hence, there is a stronger synchronization and alignment between these two teams. With that, let's see what are some of the key features of the cyber risk quantification framework that we have built in MetricStream. The first and foremost, of course, is being able to express the risk in terms of monetary value, which essentially means that at the end of every risk assessment that you perform, you will be able to see the impact of a risk in terms of dollars and cents. And the second feature is around configurable factors and formula. Whenever we talk about any risk assessment is done using a set of factors. And these factors in our framework is completely configurable, which means that an organization can define its own set of factors and also choose what kind of responses that they want to have against these factors. And for example, yes or no kind of a response or a list of value kind of a response. So you can have your own ways you set up these factors, and also you can mark these factors as either optional or mandatory. Or for example, let's say if you're doing a top-down approach of your risk assessment, and you want to, let's say, I want to understand what's my loss event frequency, and I just want to do it. If I know what's my loss event frequency, I just give the answer there. Or let's say I do not know that and I want to understand a little bit more in granular, like what's the contact frequency or what's the threat event frequency. I can set these factors as conditional factors. So in cases of risk assessments where you know the value at the top, you can go ahead and provide the answer there. But if you want to drill down further, you can set up these as conditional and respond as and when needed. Similarly, as a part of this framework, along with the configurable factors, we also have a facility, or we provide you with a formula builder where you can use these factors, the responses of these factors, or leverage the responses of these factors as an input to your formula, and uh, use one or two responses or more than one responses and perform a mathematical operation on that to arrive at a formula that is required to understand the actual impact of a particular risk. And the third feature is around the rule based scoping. So, whenever we talk about cyber risk or the IT landscape as such, we are basically talking about large number of assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. And as Joy mentioned, the threat and vulnerability landscape keeps changing constantly. So, having to perform a risk assessment, and as a part of a risk assessment, identify what is the scope on which you're performing this assessment, and to do that manually is extremely tedious. So, to tackle this problem, what we have done is we provide you with two options. One is you can have a pre-built rules return where you can, for example, let's say I want to assess all those assets which I haven't assessed in the last 1 year. So what you can do is you can write this as a rule and call this whenever you are setting up your risk assessment. Or the other ways, when I am setting up my risk assessment, I can say that I can leverage an expression builder which comes along with this framework where you can write your own expressions to understand what is the scope. So let's take an example, right? For example, let's say I want to assess all those assets which are business critical in nature, and I want to understand all those vulnerabilities with a specific exposure, or all those threats which are acting on these vulnerabilities with a certain kind of strength. So in those cases, I can just build these as an expression when I'm setting up the risk assessment, and the result of this expression basically gives you the scope on which you have to perform the risk assessment, which cuts down a lot of manual effort of figuring out what's the asset, what's the threat, what's the process, and so on. And the fourth feature as a part of this framework is the automated factor responses. So, what happens when you are responding to these factors, or the factors which you have set up as a part of the risk assessment, is some of the responses to these factors might lie in a different third party system, maybe like an SIEM tool, or it could be any other internal tools a customer is using. So in those cases, what you can do is we give you a framework where you can write simple APIs to pull the responses from these third-party systems into MetricStream Cyber Risk Quantification framework, which in turns reduces a lot of manual effort for somebody who is performing a risk assessment. They don't have to manually go enter these responses. They can fetch the value from these third-party system and leverage them in their risk assessment. So these are some of the key features of the quantification framework. With that, let me quickly switch to the actual application live demo, and let's see how this functions. So let's say if I am a cyber risk manager, the things that matter the most to me, or what I want to understand as a part of the risk assessments that I do, is what are those top 5 or 10 risks that exist, which is causing to the maximum loss, or maybe what are those top 5 business units or organizations or departments within my organization which is having a maximum cyber risk exposure. So the visualization that you see on this screen, for example, the first visualization that you see here gives you the information about the top 5 risks by annual loss exposure for a specific period, which will tell you what are the different risks that exist and what is the maximum dollar amount of loss against each of those risks. And similarly, you have another visualization which will give you what are the top 5 organizations or departments which has maximum loss against each of them. So let's say if I want to understand a little bit more details about this, what I can do is I have an option to drill down further on this. So let's say if I want to understand the unauthorized system access, that's a risk. So it will give me all the risk assessments that were done against this particular risk and what was the annual loss exposure and how did I arrive at this annual loss exposure. For example, it was a product of, let's say, loss event frequency and loss magnitude. I'll also be able to see what was the loss event frequency, what was the loss magnitude, and also a few other information around, like on which organization was it done, was it against an asset, or what were the threats, vulnerability information, and so on. So that's how, as a cyber risk manager, I'll get details around the topmost things that are important to me and top 5 organizations which has the highest risk exposure. But how do I really arrive at these values, right? Or how do I get the context of the top 5 risk and top 5 organization? So the details that you see on the screen are basically the result of the risk assessment that you perform. So let's see how do we actually go about performing a risk assessment. So to perform a risk assessment, it's basically two-step process. One is you'll have to set up your risk assessment. Second thing is you actually perform the risk assessment. So as a part of the first step when you're setting up your risk assessment, it's simple. You just come here, you give certain details around, you give a name to what your risk assessment. Let's say I'm assessing the quarter two of 2021 risk. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to assess all the business critical asset, for example. And few other things that you have to provide as an information when you're setting up this risk assessment is basically how, what, and who. So the profile that you see caters to the how aspect of it. When I say how, this will is nothing but the set of your factors and formula using which you will perform a risk assessment. So you have an option, as I mentioned before, you have an option to set up your own factors and formula. You can define that as a profile and just use that profile when you're setting up your risk assessment. And similarly, you can say what's the currency, which will basically tell you how do you want to see your monetary output based on. Is it USD, Euro, or any other currency? And the next part that you see is the scope and assignment section. So this is basically caters to the what part, in the sense, what is that you are going to assess. So for example, am I going to assess a risk based on a set of asset and threat? Or am I going to assess a risk and a process based on a set of threat and vulnerabilities? Or, for example, let's say, am I going to assess an organization against a risk, against a set of threat, vulnerability, asset class, and so on? So, you have multiple options to choose from. So, let's say if I want to go ahead and perform a risk assessment on an asset based on asset and threat combination. Now, once I've understood what's my assessment type, now I have to arrive at the scope. So as I said, you either can write your own expression or you can say manual way. But let's say if I want to write my own expression, I can select build rule. And then let's say what is the risk I want to assess. So let's say I want to assess a risk of data theft or unauthorized access to the data. So once I select my risk, now I can build my own expression saying that, let's say I want to assess all those assets whose, let's say, business criticality is, let's say, high. And I also want to assess all those threat which has, let's say, the strength of that particular threat is high. Right? So once I do this, I can say fetch scope. This will basically check all those assets whose business criticality is high and all those threat which has a strength of high and is acting upon or is contributing to this particular risk. So if you see here, I get a scope, I get like 2 router information and they have 2 different threats which like spoofing and also ransomware. So this essentially forms my scope. Now, let's say for whatever reasons I do not agree with this scope and maybe something is not relevant, even though it falls in the rule category that I've written, I always have an option to select and say delete scope. So you will be able to go ahead and delete scope and just work on the set of assets that or the set of scope that you want. Once I've determined the what part, we talked about how part, we talked about what part. The next part is who. like who will actually perform this assessment. So I can go ahead and select an assessor and approver. But let's say I am the one who is setting it up and I am the one who will probably perform the assessment. I can always say perform self-assessment and I'll just have to say who's the approver. Then just go ahead and select a particular due date and you're done. You can go ahead and submit this. This will go ahead and trigger a risk assessment. And now let's see, once the risk assessment gets triggered, what really happens, right? So let me pick up something that I've already triggered. So as a risk assessor or a cyber risk manager who is actually performing this risk assessment, of course, you will be able to see what is this risk assessment is all about, like what is the scope and what are the items that I'm really assessing. You will be able to see that information. But the most critical information on which you'll have to respond is basically your assessment itself. So you will be able to, as I said, you will be able to see all the details. So hold on, let me pick up an assessment that I just triggered. Right. So as I said, the most important part is your assessment, and you will be able to see the different factors that you will be using for this particular assessment. So let's say one of the factor is, do you know your loss event frequency, right? So if I say yes, I can go ahead and provide what's my loss event frequency. But let's say you do not know your loss event frequency directly. That means you're doing a top-down approach. You do not know what's your loss event frequency. So you want to drill down a little further and maybe answer, if check and see if you know the threat event frequency. If not, do you know the contact frequency? So how do we exactly do that? As you can say, I do not know the loss event frequency. Then if you see all these which are grayed out are basically your conditional factors. So I get to answer now, do I know my threat event frequency? So you can say, yes, I know my threat event frequency. So you can say yes. And then if you know your threat event frequency, you can start entering the details around threat event frequency. Let's say 4 times in a year is what I think is the threat event frequency. But if you do not want to do this and you already know an answer at the top level, you can just go ahead and reset your answer to say that, yes, I know the loss event frequency and maybe it's 4 times in a year. I'll go ahead and give that answer. Similarly, if you come down, you can answer the rest of the factors like, do you know what's the loss magnitude? So in this example that I'm talking about, I'm basically trying to understand what's my annual loss exposure based on the loss event frequency and the loss magnitude. So the first aspect of my formula is basically what's the loss event frequency, which I've determined here. Now I'm trying to understand what's really the loss magnitude. So I can say I know the loss magnitude. If I say yes, I get to just enter it here. Let's say I want to say it's 5,000, for example. But let's say I do not know my loss event frequency. I can say no, I do not know it. And then I can go ahead and enter my primary loss and secondary loss. So that again contributes to your formula. Basically, you are understanding what's your loss magnitude depending on the primary and the secondary loss. So I can say my primary loss is, let's say, 10,000 USD, for example. And I'm saying that, okay, I also know what's my secondary loss, which is, let's say, 5,000. But let's say in case I didn't know my secondary loss, I can further drill down to say what's my secondary loss magnitude and what's the loss event and so on. So you, as you can see, you can set up your own factors, your own responses to it, and you can also make it conditional depending upon how you want these factors to be responded. So let's say now I have given the event frequency. I've also understood what's my loss magnitude. Now I have a summary section. This will basically tell me that my annual loss exposure is around $60,000. And how did I arrive at it? Basically, it's the product of my loss magnitude and loss event frequency. And my loss event frequency is basically 4, and my loss magnitude is $15,000. And that's how I arrive at my annual loss exposure of $60,000. And this is what basically contributes to the visualization that you see here. So every time I do a risk assessment, I do an aggregation based on all the risk assessment done against a particular risk and give details around what's the top 5 risk and so on. And once I've done these assessments, there's also an ability where when you have done your assessment, you see there are issues, there are findings that you have identified. You have an option to go ahead and log them as issues in our issue management system. So basically, you can give all the details about the issues here. And once this risk assessment is submitted, it basically creates an issue in our issue management downstream application where you can take it through a closure. So that's how you go ahead and use the cyber risk quantification framework to set up your own factors, formula, and perform the assessment and basically see a visualization of your top five risk or top five organization and also the granular details about each of the assessments that you have done. So, with that, I really hope this was helpful and this will help your organization to leverage the cyber risk quantification framework. If you have any questions, please post it on the Q&A window and we'll respond to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shwetha, for taking the time and explaining the cybersecurity framework we have today in MetricStream. And with that, we will open the forum for any questions and answers.
Thank you, Shwetha, for presenting how MetricStream has approached this kind of a framework, right? So there are many such quantification platforms which are available today in the market. And I understand that MetricStream is trying to build a custom platform which is not particular to a methodology, but it's trying to bring other methodology also together and come up with a custom quantification model, right? So where do you see this custom quantification model being different from the other CRQ vendors?
Okay. Hey, thanks, Joy, for that question. I think previously when you were discussing on a panel discussion with Tony, I think this was also an aspect that was brought in where Tony mentioned, or you also mentioned that there can't be a customer or all customers or all organizations following one way of doing cyber risk quantification. There can't be a prescriptive way of doing it for everyone. So that's where this whole custom quantification model or a framework which is extremely flexible comes into picture. So what we do, just to summarize what we really do at MetricStream and how it helps any customer is, first and foremost, we at MetricStream, we have a rich, comprehensive interlinked libraries where you can go ahead and define your GRC taxonomies, could be risk, processes, assets, and threats, and vulnerabilities, and so on. And I think this was also a point that Tony was mentioning. Some of the basic elements when you have to do cyber risk quantification is identifying your threats, vulnerability, assets, and so on. So we at MetricStream, our framework also caters to performing a threat modeling or a threat assessment, where you can understand what are the different, what's the strength of a particular threat and what could be the likelihood of that being realized. And you can also understand whether it really applies to your organization or not. And also you can go ahead and perform identify assets, and you can also go ahead and bring in the vulnerability data and see if it really impacts your business critical assets and what happens if this vulnerability is exploited, what could be the impact of it. And you can also do your control testing and understand the effectiveness of the control. So with all these elements combined, you can actually go ahead and perform a quantification, that's a cyber risk quantification assessment, by leveraging some of the like a taxonomy of factors that I just demoed in a product, where you have an entirely configurable framework available, where it could be fair factors, it could be a different framework altogether, or it could be a modification to a framework that our organization is doing, or it could be their own methodology that they're following. So they can bring in any of these aspects into our framework, set them up as factors or taxonomy of factors, and also you can leverage the responses of these each of these framework in our framework, in our responses of all these factors in our framework to really quantify and understand what's that dollar amount or the monetary value against each of the risk. So that way, if you look at it, this is not restricted to one specific kind of framework. It caters to different organizations, maybe different industries, and how different customers approach it.
So that's an excellent way of looking at it, Shweta. So essentially, in a nutshell, MetricStream offers that kind of an open-ended platform where you can really configure items very easily by click of a button, right? For a given customer, what threats are relevant, what assets are relevant, what kind of risk do you really want to quantify and measure, right? And that gives the full flexibility in terms of, do you want to really do a top-down approach, you want to do a bottom-up approach, or you want to make it more of an, it's a kind of an estimation model, right? So thanks for that. So Shwetha, we have one more question coming from the audience. What guidance would you provide when estimating magnitude? I guess in this case we mean the cyber risk quantification, right? Should they put in the highest possible, i.e., the risk exposure, or a value that is more likely to be incurred? So I guess the question is more towards uh, how do we measure our risk exposure, right? And I think one of the questions, this was probably answered in our panel discussion, right? It's an exposure number. It doesn't mean that you are going to incur that particular loss, right? You may incur that particular loss, but there's a certain level of confidence level also to this exposure number. So when a particular event happens, there is a particular, at a certain confidence level today, you can say if that event happens, then we can incur that amount of loss, but you may or may not incur that amount of loss, right? So do you want to add anything to that, Shwetha?
I think you covered it, and it could be, as you said, depending on the confidence level. You could be 90% confident or 80% confident, like how you want to, take that. I think, but you precisely summed it up that it's the exposure.
Yeah. So, and this is something we use for credit risk or market risk modeling, where risk is always associated with a certain level of confidence level, right? And the question is, as of today, how do you see the future is the more important thing, right? That's what risk exposure would mean. It's always called the potential exposure, if you will. Right? So thank you, Shwetha, and that was a great overview of the MetricStream platform. And thank you all for watching this.
Thanks, everyone.